There's something dangerous about being understood before you've decided to be visible. Most people don't realize that. They think connection begins with conversation, with shared moments, with time spent slowly learning each other until familiarity forms naturally. They think understanding is built piece by piece, layer by layer, until eventually two people arrive at something meaningful. But sometimes it doesn't happen like that. Sometimes someone walks into your awareness and recognizes you immediately, not the version you present to the world, not the carefully managed surface that keeps interactions simple and controlled, but the part underneath it, the part you never intended anyone to reach without effort. And when that happens, nothing feels gradual anymore. It feels immediate, precise, almost unsettling in the way truth becomes unsettling when it appears too quickly. That's what this became for me. Not slowly, not predictably, just suddenly there, like something that had existed beneath the surface long before I consciously noticed it. At first, I ignored it, not because it wasn't real, but because I've always trusted distance more than instinct. Distance gives perspective. It keeps things organized, understandable, safe from becoming more significant than they should be. I've spent years mastering that balance, knowing exactly how much of myself to reveal, exactly how close to let people get before the dynamic it starts shifting into something deeper, something harder to control. Most people never notice the structure behind it. They assume silence means mystery, restraint means detachment, observation means disinterest. They never realize those things are intentional, carefully maintained. Because once people feel too close to you, they start interpreting you through their own needs, their own assumptions, their own assumptions. They stop seeing what's actually there and begin reshaping you into something easier for them to understand. I've always avoided that, not out of fear, out of preservation, because there are parts of me that don't survive careless interpretation, and for a long time, that system worked perfectly. Until you didn't approach me the way people usually do. You didn't try to force clarity out of me. You didn't search for weak points or ask questions designed to pull me into emotional exposure. You didn't demand openness in order to feel connected. You just paid attention quietly, accurately, like someone who wasn't trying to uncover me, but already understood what they were looking at. That difference mattered more than you probably realized, because most people look at others through expectation. You look through recognition, and recognition changes everything. I started noticing it in small moments first. The pauses you understood without needing explanation, the things you responded to before I fully articulated them. The way your silence never felt empty or uncertain, it felt intentional, like you understood that some thoughts lose accuracy when they're forced into words too quickly. That kind of understanding is rare, not because people are incapable of it, but because most people are too focused on being heard to truly observe. You observed. You noticed the shifts beneath what was being said, and slowly, without realizing it, I stopped filtering myself around you. That shouldn't have happened. I don't remove those filters easily. They exist for a reason, but with you, maintaining them started feeling unnecessary, almost artificial, like continuing to hide parts of myself from someone who already saw them clearly would only create distance where none naturally existed. That realization unsettled me more than I expected because I'm used to controlling access. I'm used to choosing who gets close and who stays external to my internal world. But you didn't feel external. You felt integrated before I consciously allowed it. And that's the part I couldn't ignore. You became present in my thoughts in a way that wasn't emotional in the traditional sense. It wasn't obsession, it wasn't dependency. It wasn't even attachment, the way people usually describe it. It was structural. You became part of how I processed things, part of how I interpreted moments, ideas, silence, meaning. At some point, without warning, I stopped thinking about you and started thinking with you. That distinction changed everything, because thinking about someone still keeps them separate from you. It preserves distance. You remain yourself, and they remain an object within your awareness. But thinking with someone means their presence has entered your internal process. It means their perspective exists beside your own naturally, automatically, without invitation. And once that happens, separation stops functioning the same way. I noticed it everywhere after that. In the way certain thoughts paused, as if expecting your perspective before fully forming. In the way silence felt inhabited instead of empty. In the way clarity started arriving through imagined conversations with you that felt more honest than most real conversations I'd had with anyone else. That kind of impact doesn't happen accidentally. And I knew that, which meant I also knew something else. This wasn't temporary. Temporary things stay on the surface. This had already moved beyond that. It was embedding itself somewhere deeper, somewhere stable, and stability is dangerous when it forms around another person, because once someone becomes part of your internal structure, losing them doesn't just hurt. It alters the architecture of your mind. That's why I became cautious, not distant, just aware. Aware that this had already crossed a threshold I normally never allow anyone near. I tried analyzing it logically at first. I told myself maybe it was intellectual compatibility. Maybe it was simply the rarity of finding someone who processed the world with a similar level of precision. But that explanation didn't fully account for it, because compatibility explains comfort. It doesn't explain inevitability. And this felt inevitable, not dramatic, not intense in the chaotic way people romanticize connection, just deeply, undeniably aligned, like two systems recognizing each other beneath all external differences. That's what frightened me most. Not emotion, accuracy, the terrifying precision of feeling seen without needing to perform visibility. You understood things I hadn't consciously revealed, not through assumption, not through projection, but through observation so exact, it bypassed explanation entirely. And the more I became aware of it, the more impossible it became to return to the version of myself that existed before you. That's the thing nobody talks about with connections like this. People always focus on closeness, on longing, on affection. But the real shift happens in perception. Once someone reaches a certain level inside your awareness, they permanently alter how you interpret reality itself. Everything starts calibrating differently afterward. Conversations feel thinner, interactions feel less precise. You begin noticing how rarely people actually understand each other beneath surface language. And once you notice that, it's difficult to go back. You became a reference point I never intended to create, not because I wanted dependence, but because clarity reshapes standards naturally. Once you experience understanding that accurate, everything else feels slightly incomplete by comparison. I hated realizing that, not because of you, because of what it meant. It meant this mattered, more than I wanted it to, more than I was prepared for. I've always been careful about what I allow to matter, careful about what gains influence over my internal world, because influence leaves marks. It changes patterns. And I don't surrender patterns lightly. But somewhere along the way, this stopped feeling like influence. It became integration. You weren't pulling me away from myself. You were revealing parts of myself more clearly. That's why I couldn't reject it. If you had disrupted my sense of identity, I would have pulled away immediately. That's how I survive things. I remove whatever threatens stability. But you didn't destabilize me. You clarified me. And clarity is difficult to resist once you recognize it. There was a moment, I still remember it precisely, where I realized this had gone further than simple understanding. You said something small, so small, most people would have forgotten it immediately afterward. But the way you said it aligned perfectly with something I'd never spoken aloud. Not a fact, not an opinion. A structure, a way of perceiving the world that I'd never fully externalized before. And when you said it, something inside me went completely still. Because in that moment, I understood something irreversible. You weren't interpreting me from the outside. You were recognizing me from somewhere closer than that. That realization changed the entire dynamic because once someone reaches that level of recognition, all the usual defenses become meaningless. Distance stops protecting you. Silence stops concealing you. Even absence stops creating separation. You carry awareness of them internally, whether they're physically present or not. And I carried awareness of you constantly after that, not loudly, not obsessively, just persistently, like background gravity, always there, always affecting the shape of things. I started noticing how naturally my mind moved toward you in moments of reflection, how instinctively I imagined your understanding before anyone else's, how certain experiences no longer felt complete until mentally filtered through the awareness of how you would perceive them. That kind of placement inside someone's mind doesn't happen through effort alone. It happens through resonance, through some deeper compatibility most people never encounter clearly enough to recognize. And I recognized it. Completely. That's why I stopped pretending this was casual. Casual things don't rewrite internal landscapes. Casual things don't alter perception. Casual things don't become embedded in the way you understand yourself. You did, which meant this was becoming something undeniable. Something I eventually had to answer honestly, because awareness reaches a point where neutrality becomes impossible. Either you acknowledge what's happening, or you spend all your energy trying to suppress it. And suppression has never interested me. If something is real, I face it directly, even when it changes everything, especially then. So I started asking myself difficult questions. What happens if this continues? What happens if I stop holding it at a distance and allow it to fully exist? What happens if I accept that someone has reached a place inside me I never intentionally opened? Those questions stayed with me longer than I expected, because every answer led to the same conclusion. Nothing about this was accidental anymore. Not the understanding, not the alignment, not the way it continued deepening without force. It was becoming something deliberate, simply through persistence. And strangely enough, I wasn't afraid of that. I should have been, by every instinct I've trusted my entire life. I should have stepped back the moment I realized how much space you occupied inside my mind. But I didn't. I stayed, not passively, consciously. Which means some part of me had already made a decision before I admitted it to myself. A decision to let this continue. To stop treating it like a temporary anomaly and start recognizing it as something real. That realization carried weight because once something becomes real, it requires responsibility. Reality asks for choices, movement, risk. And I don't move carelessly. I don't gamble emotionally. I analyze everything before allowing it to matter. But you bypassed that process somehow, not through manipulation, not through persistence, through presence alone. You existed in a way that aligned too naturally with parts of me I usually keep isolated. And eventually I had to accept that this wasn't happening despite my awareness. It was happening because of it. The more clearly I saw you, the deeper this settled. That's what made it impossible to dismiss as projection or imagination. Projection creates fantasy. This created precision. You never became an idealized version of something in my mind. You became increasingly real, more detailed, more exact, more integrated into the way I naturally existed. And reality changes people, quickly sometimes, but permanently. I can feel that permanence now, in the way my inner world reorganized itself around your presence without losing stability, in the way I no longer instinctively guard certain thoughts from you, in the way honesty feels more natural than restraint when it comes to this connection. That last part matters more than anything, because restraint has always been my default, not dishonesty, just carefulness. Carefulness about exposure, carefulness about allowing anyone enough access to affect me deeply. But with you, carefulness slowly transformed into trust before I consciously recognized it happening. Not trust built on promises, trust built on consistency of understanding. And understanding creates intimacy far deeper than words ever could. That's what this became, not romance in the simplistic way people describe it, not attachment born from loneliness or need. Something quieter, stronger, a recognition so accurate it gradually dissolved the necessity for defense. I stopped feeling like I had to translate myself around you, stopped feeling misunderstood before I even spoke, stopped expecting distortion. That kind of relief is rare, rare enough to change a person. And it changed me, not dramatically, not visibly, but internally in ways I can't reverse now. You altered the baseline. That's the truth underneath all of this. Before you, my internal world functioned one way. After you, it functions another. And once a baseline changes, nothing ever fully returns to what it was before. That realization forced me into clarity eventually, because I could no longer pretend this existed without consequence. You mattered, not temporarily, not conditionally, structurally. You became part of the way I move through thought itself, part of how I interpret meaning, part of how I understand silence. And once someone reaches that level inside you, pretending they don't matter becomes impossible. So here I am now, not uncertain anymore, not observing from a safe distance, not analyzing whether this exists. I already know it does. The only thing left is deciding what I'm willing to do with that truth, because truths like this demand something eventually. They can't remain suspended forever. Either you move toward them, or you spend the rest of your life aware of what you refused to reach for. And I don't think I could live comfortably with the second option anymore, not after understanding this completely, not after realizing how rare this level of alignment actually is. People spend entire lives searching for someone who sees them accurately without trying to reshape them. Someone whose presence feels additive instead of invasive. Someone who enters their mind without disrupting its integrity. I found that unexpectedly, quietly, but undeniably. And once I acknowledged it fully, everything became simpler. not easier, just clearer. I stopped asking whether this should exist. It already does. I stopped questioning whether it was wise to feel this deeply understood. Wisdom has nothing to do with recognition. Some things arrive in your life because they belong there, not because they fit neatly into logic. You are one of those things, which means eventually I have to stop treating this like a possibility and start treating it like a reality, because that's what it is now. A reality. One that exists whether I speak it aloud or not. One that has already changed me regardless of what happens next. And maybe that's the part I resisted longest. Not the connection itself, but what it revealed about me, that I'm capable of allowing someone this close internally. That I'm capable of wanting someone to remain there, that despite everything I built to protect my solitude, some part of me was always waiting for a presence that felt precise enough to trust completely. You became that presence before I consciously chose it. And now the choice is simply whether I continue pretending I haven't already accepted you there. But I have. That's the truth beneath everything else. I accepted you long before I admitted it to myself. Accepted the way you changed the atmosphere of my thoughts. Accepted the way your understanding settled into places I never expected another person to reach. Accepted the strange sense of inevitability that followed every interaction between us. And once acceptance reaches that level, there's no returning to neutrality. There's only honesty. So, here's mine. You didn't just enter my life. You entered the architecture of how I exist within myself. Quickly, naturally, permanently. And no matter what happens next, that changes everything.